I was 70 years old when I accidentally heard my daughter discussing the perfect gift she wanted for Christmas. Most fathers expect to hear things like a vacation, jewelry, or maybe a new car. I expected nothing at all. At my age, you learn that the best gifts are usually simple moments with the people you love. What I heard instead changed the way I looked at my family forever. Honestly, Valerie said with a laugh, "The best gift Dad could give us would be the day he's finally gone." For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood. I was standing in the hallway outside the kitchen, holding a grocery bag filled with ingredients for Leo's favorite cookies. My grandson had asked me to bake with him that afternoon. The words didn't make sense, not coming from my daughter, not from the little girl I had carried on my shoulders during summer parades, not from the child whose tears I had wiped away after every nightmare. Then Derek laughed. That would solve a lot of problems. The sound of his voice hit me harder than Valerie's words. Derek had been my son-in-law for nearly 15 years. I never trusted him completely, but I had spent years convincing myself that Valerie loved him and that was enough. Through the partially open kitchen door, I could see them sitting at the table. Valerie was scrolling through her phone while Derek drank coffee. Neither looked angry, neither looked emotional. They were discussing my death the same way people discuss the weather. Casual, comfortable, almost amused. "We'd finally be able to sell this place," Valerie continued. "You know how much the property value has gone up?" Derek nodded. "And no more medical bills, no more appointments, no more worrying about what happens when he gets worse." Worse. The word echoed in my mind. I wasn't sick. I wasn't dying. I still drove myself everywhere. I still exercised every morning. I still managed my finances without help. Yet somehow, in their minds, I had already become a burden waiting to happen. My grip tightened around the grocery bag. For a second, I considered walking into the kitchen and confronting them. I imagined the shock on their faces. I imagined demanding an explanation. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the calmness in Valerie's voice. Maybe it was the fact that neither of them sounded guilty. People usually hide cruel thoughts. My daughter wasn't hiding hers. That terrified me more than the words themselves. I quietly stepped backward and moved toward the front door before they noticed me. A few minutes later, I walked back inside through the kitchen entrance and announced my arrival loudly. Valerie smiled immediately. "Dad, you're back." Derek looked up from his coffee. "How was the store?" I stared at both of them. If I hadn't heard the conversation myself, I would have believed their concern was genuine. Valerie even stood and kissed my cheek, the same daughter who had just joked about the day I died. "Leo's upstairs," she said. "He's been waiting for you." I forced a smile. "I'll go see him." The rest of the afternoon felt like a performance. I baked cookies with my grandson. I listened to Valerie talk about neighborhood gossip. I watched Derek complain about work. And the entire time, I couldn't stop replaying those words in my head. The best gift Dad could give us would be the day he's finally gone. That night, after everyone went to bed, I sat alone in my study. The house was silent, except for the ticking of the old grandfather clock near my desk. I looked around the room and remembered how much of my life was contained within those walls. 46 years earlier, my late wife and I had purchased the property when Valerie was still a baby. Every promotion I earned, every overtime shift I worked, every sacrifice I made had been for my family. After my wife passed away 6 years earlier, I transferred part ownership of the house to Valerie because I wanted her to feel secure. I trusted her completely. Now, I found myself wondering whether that had been the biggest mistake of my life. Around midnight, I opened my financial records. For years, I had handled everything myself: savings accounts, investments, retirement funds, property taxes, insurance. As I reviewed the documents, something caught my attention. Several pieces of mail were missing. At first, I assumed I had misplaced them. Then I remembered something. 2 weeks earlier, I had been expecting a statement from one of my investment accounts. It never arrived. Valerie had told me the mail service was unreliable lately. At the time, I believed her. Now I wasn't so sure. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual and checked the mailbox before anyone else. Most of the letters were junk advertisements. But mixed among them was a notice from my bank informing me that someone had recently requested information about account access procedures. I frowned. I hadn't made any requests. Slowly, A feeling I hadn't experienced in years settled into my chest. Suspicion. Later that day, I casually mentioned the letter during lunch. Valerie nearly dropped her fork. It happened so quickly that most people wouldn't have noticed. I did. "That's strange," she said. "Maybe the bank made a mistake." Derek immediately changed the subject. My suspicion grew stronger. Over the next week, I began paying closer attention. Little things started standing out. Valerie asking more questions about my will. Derek suddenly expressing interest in my investment portfolio. Missing mail. Conversations that abruptly stopped when I entered a room. Separately, each incident seemed harmless. Together, they painted a troubling picture. Then something happened that removed all remaining doubt. One evening, I came downstairs for a glass of water and heard voices in the living room. Valerie and Derek thought I was asleep. "How much longer do you think it'll take?" Derek asked quietly. Valerie sighed. "I don't know, but we need to start preparing." "Preparing for what?" Derek asked. Valerie's answer froze me in place. "For when everything finally becomes ours." I stood there in the darkness, hidden from view. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. Everything becomes ours. Suddenly, the conversation from the kitchen made sense. This wasn't frustration. This wasn't a cruel joke. This was expectation. They weren't talking about losing a father. They were talking about gaining an inheritance. And for the first time in my life, I realized a terrible possibility. My daughter and her husband weren't waiting for me to die. They were planning for it. I quietly returned to my room and locked the door. Sleep never came that night. As dawn approached, I sat by the window staring into the darkness. The grief was overwhelming, but beneath the grief, another emotion was beginning to grow. Determination. If Valerie and Derek believed I was a helpless old man, I wasn't going to correct them. Not yet. Because something far bigger was happening inside my own home. And before I made a single move, I needed to know exactly how far they were willing to go. The answer arrived sooner than I expected. 3 days later, Derek walked into my study with a desperate expression on his face and a story that would reveal the first piece of their real plan. For the next 3 days, I became an actor inside my own home. Every smile I gave Valerie was fake. Every friendly conversation with Derek felt like a performance. The hardest part was pretending nothing had changed when, in reality, everything had. I wanted to believe there was some innocent explanation for what I had heard. I wanted to believe my daughter wasn't waiting for the day she inherited my assets. But years of managing people in business had taught me one important lesson. When someone shows you who they are behind closed doors, believe them. On the 4th afternoon, Derek finally made his move. He knocked softly on my study door and stepped inside carrying an expression I had never seen before. He looked nervous, almost emotional. If I hadn't already suspected him, I might have fallen for the act. "Harrison," he said quietly, "do you have a minute?" I closed the book I was reading and nodded. "Of course." He sat down across from me and rubbed his hands together. "It's about Leo." The moment he mentioned my grandson, my attention sharpened. Leo was 11 years old and the brightest part of my life. Ever since my wife passed away, that boy had given me more reasons to smile than anyone else. Derek lowered his eyes. "We got some bad news from the doctor." My stomach tightened immediately. "What happened?" Derek hesitated just long enough to make his story seem real. "They're concerned about a medical condition. There are tests, specialists, treatments. Insurance isn't covering everything." He sighed heavily. "We're trying to figure it out, but the costs are overwhelming." Any grandfather would have been worried. I certainly was. Yet something felt wrong. Derek wasn't talking like a frightened father. He was talking like a salesman building toward a request. Then he finally arrived at the point. "I hate asking this, Harrison, but we could really use some help." There it was, the real reason for the conversation. I leaned back in my chair and studied him carefully. "How much help?" Derek looked relieved that I hadn't immediately refused. "Around $75,000. The number hit me like a slap, not because I couldn't afford it, because it was too specific, too rehearsed, almost as if he and Valerie had discussed it beforehand. "That's a lot of money," I said calmly. "I know," Derek nodded. "But this is Leo we're talking about." He knew exactly which emotional button to press. For a few seconds, I remained silent. Then I smiled. "Let me think about it." Derek's shoulders relaxed. "Thank you. That's all I'm asking." After he left, I immediately called Leo's pediatrician. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. By the time it ended, my suspicions had become certainty. Leo wasn't sick. There were no specialists, no emergency treatments, no diagnosis. Derek had lied about everything. I sat quietly at my desk, staring at the wall. The betrayal hurt, but not for the reason most people would assume. It wasn't about the money. It was about using a child as a weapon, using my grandson's health to manipulate me. That crossed a line I didn't know they were capable of crossing. That evening, I agreed to help. Derek nearly looked excited when I told him. The next morning, I wrote a check, but not for $75,000. Instead, I intentionally made a small error. One digit was incorrect. It was enough to cause problems when deposited, but not enough to appear obvious. Then I waited. The reaction came faster than expected. Less than 2 hours later, Valerie stormed into my room. "Dad, the bank rejected the check." I looked up from my newspaper with deliberate confusion. "Rejected it?" "Yes." Her voice carried more anger than concern. "There was a mistake." I adjusted my glasses. "Oh, was there?" Valerie stared at me. "Can you write another one?" For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. Then something interesting happened. I saw irritation flash across her face. Not disappointment, not worry about Leo. Irritation, almost as if the failed transaction had ruined a plan. "Of course," I said. "I'll take care of it tomorrow." Valerie forced a smile and walked away. Later that night, I overheard another conversation. "What happened?" Derek asked. "He screwed up the check." Valerie sounded frustrated. "Do you think he's starting to forget things?" Derek was quiet for a second. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "That might actually help us." Silence followed. Then Valerie laughed softly. "Maybe you're right." I sat on the edge of my bed, staring into darkness. "Help us." The words echoed in my mind. They weren't worried about my memory. They wanted me to lose it, or at least appear to lose it. The next morning, I rewrote the check exactly as requested. This time it cleared without issue. Derek thanked me repeatedly. Valerie hugged me. Both pretended to be grateful. Meanwhile, I began paying closer attention than ever before. Over the following weeks, strange things continued happening. Important mail disappeared. Documents were moved from my desk. Valerie frequently asked whether I remembered conversations that had never happened. Sometimes she would insist I had forgotten appointments I never scheduled. At first, each incident seemed minor, but eventually a pattern emerged. Someone was creating a narrative, a story. An elderly man becoming forgetful, confused, unreliable. The realization terrified me, because if that story became believable enough, it could be used against me. One evening, while cleaning my desk, I found something unusual hidden beneath a stack of papers. It was a brochure from a senior care facility located 30 miles away. I had never seen it before, yet my name was written across the top in Valerie's handwriting. I stared at the brochure for a long time. The smiling faces, the landscaped gardens, the promises of professional care. Most people would have viewed it as harmless. I didn't, because suddenly I remembered the conversation from the kitchen. The best gift Dad could give us would be the day he's finally gone. Maybe they weren't waiting for me to die. Maybe they had found another way to remove me from their lives. And if that was true, then everything I had discovered so far was only the beginning. The real plan was still hidden beneath the surface. But somewhere inside this house, the evidence existed. I just had to find it before they made their next move. The brochure stayed hidden inside my desk drawer for 3 days. I looked at it every morning and every night, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. Maybe Valerie had picked it up at a doctor's office. Maybe she was planning for the future. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. But deep down, I already knew better. Too many strange things had happened in too short a period of time. The missing mail, the conversations about my memory, the fake story about Leo's illness. None of it felt accidental anymore. Someone was building a case against me, one small step at a time. The following Friday, I got another opportunity to observe Derek. Around lunchtime, he appeared in the kitchen looking stressed. Valerie wasn't home. Leo was at school. It was just the two of us. Derek poured himself coffee and sighed dramatically. "I don't know how much more pressure I can handle." I kept reading my newspaper. Work problems? He laughed bitterly. Among other things. Then he sat across from me and rubbed his forehead. Sometimes I feel like I'm drowning. I said nothing. Eventually he leaned forward. You know, Harrison, I hate asking for help. That sentence alone told me exactly where the conversation was heading. Derek never discussed problems unless money was involved. What's going on? I asked. He hesitated. The treatments for Leo are costing more than we expected. Another lie. This time I didn't feel sadness. I felt anger. That's unfortunate, I replied calmly. Derek nodded. We've already drained most of our savings. He lowered his voice. To be honest, we're in serious trouble. Then he named another number. $50,000. Different amount. Same performance. Same fake concern. Same manipulation. This time I decided to test him. I'd like to see the medical bills first, I said. For a fraction of a second, panic flashed across his face. It disappeared quickly, but not quickly enough. The bills? Yes. I smiled politely. If I'm helping, I'd like to understand exactly what's happening. Derek shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Of course, he forced a laugh. That makes sense. But I could already see his mind racing. He hadn't prepared for questions. He had only prepared for a check. That evening, I secretly followed him. It was something I never imagined doing to my own son-in-law, but trust had already died. Around 7 o'clock, Derek left the house, claiming he had an important business meeting. Instead of driving downtown, he headed toward the expensive waterfront district on the other side of town. I stayed several cars behind. 20 minutes later, he pulled into the parking lot of a luxury restaurant. What happened next surprised even me. A young woman stepped out of the restaurant and hugged him. Not a friendly hug. Not a professional greeting. The kind of hug that only exists between two people involved in a relationship. My stomach dropped. Derek kissed her. Then they walked inside together. I sat in my car, staring through the windshield. Part of me wanted to look away. Another part wanted proof. An hour later, I followed them again. They drove to a condominium building overlooking the marina. Derek spent the night there. He never came home. The next morning, I hired a private investigator. If my family was collecting information on me, I intended to return the favor. The investigator's name was Robert Gaines, a retired detective with 30 years of experience. After listening to my concerns, he asked one question. How much are you prepared to learn? It was an odd question. What do you mean? Robert folded his hands. People usually hire me because they suspect something. Sometimes the truth is much worse than they expect. I thought about Valerie, about the kitchen conversation, about the brochure, about Derek's lies. Then I answered honestly, I need the truth, no matter what it is. Robert nodded. Then give me a week. 6 days later, he called. His voice sounded grim. You should come to my office. The evidence waiting for me there changed everything. Robert handed me a folder nearly 2 inches thick. Inside were photographs, bank records, travel receipts, credit card statements, and surveillance reports. Derek wasn't struggling financially. In fact, he had spent more than $80,000 over the past year on luxury hotels, expensive gifts, and trips with the woman from the restaurant. Her name was Melissa Carter. She lived in Miami. Derek had been maintaining the relationship for nearly 3 years. Worse still, the money came from loans he secretly obtained using family assets as collateral. Assets connected to Valerie. Assets connected to my home. My hands trembled as I turned the pages. There's more, Robert said quietly. I looked up. More? He slid another document toward me. The story about your grandson's illness. My chest tightened. What about it? Robert pointed to the report. Completely fabricated. I already knew that, but the next sentence stunned me. We found messages between Derek and Melissa discussing how they planned to use the fake medical crisis to get money from you. I felt sick. They had laughed about it, joked about it, used Leo's name as part of a scam. Robert watched my reaction carefully. I'm sorry, Harrison. I stared at the photographs scattered across the desk. Does Valerie know? Robert was silent for several seconds. Then he answered. That's the question we're still investigating. The drive home felt longer than usual. I kept hoping Robert would call and tell me there had been a mistake. He never did. When I arrived home, Valerie greeted me with a smile. How was your day? She asked. I looked at her face and searched for some sign that she was innocent, some indication that she had no idea what Derek was doing. Instead, I noticed something strange. On the kitchen counter sat a stack of financial documents. My financial documents. Valerie quickly covered them with a magazine when she saw me looking. Then she smiled again. "Everything okay, Dad?" I forced myself to smile back. "Everything's fine." But inside, I felt a new kind of fear. Because if Valerie knew about Derek's lies, then my son-in-law wasn't the real threat. He was just part of it. And if she didn't know, then someone inside this house was keeping dangerous secrets from both of us. Either way, the situation was far worse than I originally imagined. Then, later that night, Robert sent me a text message containing 6 words that made my blood run cold. Robert's message stayed on my phone for nearly 5 minutes before I found the strength to open it again. "Valerie knows more than we thought." 6 simple words. 6 words that made the entire house feel colder around me. I sat alone in my basement room, staring at the screen, while the ceiling above me carried the muffled sounds of Valerie and Derek walking through the mansion I had paid for. For 3 days, I had allowed myself one small hope. Maybe my daughter was being deceived. Maybe Derek was the true parasite. Maybe Valerie had been careless, selfish, even cruel, but not evil. That hope began dying the moment Robert sent me the next file. It was a screenshot of a bank transfer. My name was listed as the account holder. Valerie's name appeared as the authorized recipient. The transfer was not large enough to trigger emergency alerts, but it was large enough to matter. Then came another screenshot. Then another. Over several months, money had been quietly moving out of my accounts in amounts small enough to hide inside normal household expenses. I felt my throat tighten. I was not looking at one theft. I was looking at a pattern. The next morning, I tested her. At breakfast, I sat at the marble island with my coffee and said softly, "Valerie, did my bank statement come in this week?" She did not even blink. "No, Dad." "Why?" "I usually get it by now." She smiled with that careful softness people use when speaking to someone they want to control. "You got it 2 days ago, remember? You said the numbers confused you, so you asked me to put it somewhere safe." I looked at her for a long second. "I said that?" Her eyes filled with fake concern. "Yes, Dad. You really don't remember?" Derek looked up from his tablet. "Harrison, nobody is judging you. Memory problems happen at your age." There it was. Not just theft. Not just lies. They were rewriting my reality in real time, right to my face. I lowered my eyes and let my shoulders sink. Maybe I forgot. Valerie reached across the counter and touched my hand. "That's why we're here. You don't have to handle everything alone anymore." Her fingers felt warm. Her words felt poisonous. That afternoon, I went back to my room and opened every financial file I still possessed. I compared old statements, tax records, investment summaries, and check copies. The missing money became clearer with every page. Some transfers were labeled as home maintenance, others as medical reimbursements. A few were marked as consulting fees. I had authorized none of them. By evening, Robert called again. "Harrison, she is not just aware of Derek's spending. She is managing part of it." I closed my eyes. "How much?" "Enough to prove intent." He explained that Valerie had created a private holding account under the excuse of helping me simplify expenses. Several intercepted statements had been redirected electronically. Derek's lies were ugly, but Valerie's were cleaner, smarter, more patient. She was not reacting to opportunity. She was building a cage. Later that night, I found the next piece by accident. I was looking for an old insurance folder in the storage closet outside the laundry room when I noticed a small black device mounted high in the corner. At first glance, it looked like part of the alarm system, but the lens was angled inward, toward the basement stairs. I checked the hallway. Another camera. Then the kitchen. Another. They were not monitoring burglars. They were monitoring me. Every trip upstairs. Every moment of confusion I pretended to have. Every dropped cup. Every quiet walk at night. They were collecting footage to support the story that I was declining. Suddenly, the missing bank statements made sense. The fake conversations made sense. The senior care brochure made sense. Valerie and Derek were not simply hoping I would fade away. They were preparing evidence to prove I no longer belonged in charge of my own life. That realization changed something in me. Fear became focus. pain became calculation. For 40 years, I had inspected bridges, towers, and foundations. When a structure failed, you did not blame the crack. You traced the pressure back to the source. And the source in this house was my daughter. The next morning, Valerie came downstairs carrying a tray with tea, toast, and a small porcelain dish. In the dish sat my usual vitamins, my blood pressure pill, and one pale blue tablet I had never seen before. She smiled gently. "Dr. Aris changed your medication, Dad. He said this should help with your confusion." My hand did not move. "Dr. Aris changed it without speaking to me?" Valerie laughed softly. "He knows what is best. You trust me, don't you?" I looked at the blue pill, then at her face. The little girl I once held in a hospital room was gone. In her place stood a woman who could smile while trying to control what entered my body. I picked up the pill and pretended to swallow it with tea, hiding it beneath my tongue until she left. The moment the basement door closed, I spit it into a tissue and sealed it inside a plastic bag. I did not know what the pill was yet, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. My daughter had just crossed from betrayal into danger. And the next morning, I took that blue pill to a private laboratory to find out exactly what they were trying to do to me. The laboratory was located 40 minutes away in a neighboring city. I arrived early the next morning, carrying the blue pill sealed inside a plastic evidence bag. The technician behind the counter probably assumed I was another worried patient seeking reassurance. In reality, I felt like a man trying to determine whether his own daughter was poisoning him. Even thinking those words made me sick. I paid extra for expedited testing and drove home with a knot in my stomach that refused to loosen. For the next 48 hours, I continued pretending everything was normal. Every morning, Valerie brought me another blue pill. Every morning, I pretended to swallow it. Every morning, I secretly added it to a growing collection hidden inside an old cigar box beneath my workbench. Meanwhile, Valerie's behavior became increasingly strange. She frequently asked whether I remembered recent conversations. She would casually mention events that never happened and then look disappointed when I denied them. Sometimes Derek joined the game. "Remember when you left the stove on last week?" he would ask. That was dangerous. The problem was that I hadn't left the stove on. I hadn't even used it that day. Yet they repeated these stories so often that an outsider might eventually believe them. One afternoon, I overheard Valerie speaking on the phone. "It's getting easier," she said quietly. "He's questioning himself now." I couldn't hear the other person's response, but I didn't need to. The sentence alone was enough. They weren't observing memory problems. They were trying to create them. 2 days later, the laboratory called. The technician's voice sounded unusually serious. "Mr. Bennett, we'd prefer discussing the results in person." My heart sank. Most routine tests weren't delivered that way. An hour later, I sat across from a toxicology specialist reviewing the report. The man adjusted his glasses and looked directly at me. "Who prescribed this medication?" "My daughter's physician," I answered. "Why?" He slid the report across the desk. "Because this medication should never have been given to someone under the circumstances you've described." My pulse accelerated. "What is it?" He pointed to the chemical name. "A powerful antipsychotic medication." For several seconds, I simply stared at him. "But I don't have a psychiatric condition." "According to this report, no." He nodded. "In healthy individuals, prolonged use can cause confusion, memory impairment, fatigue, emotional instability, and symptoms that may resemble cognitive decline." The room suddenly felt smaller. "You're telling me this could make someone appear mentally impaired?" "Yes," his answer came immediately, "especially an elderly individual." My mouth went dry. Every missing document, every conversation about forgetfulness, every fake concern, every camera. Suddenly, everything fit together. They weren't waiting for me to become confused. They were trying to make me confused. I drove home in complete silence. The betrayal I had already experienced was painful. This was something different. This was calculated, deliberate, dangerous. When I arrived home, Valerie greeted me with a smile. "How was your day?" she asked. I looked at her face and wondered how long she had been participating in this plan. Weeks? Months? Years? Had she ever felt guilty? Had she ever hesitated? "It was fine," I replied. She nodded. "Don't forget your medication tonight." The words sounded almost caring. Almost. That evening, after everyone went to bed, I called Robert and told him everything. The line remained silent for several moments. Finally, he spoke. Harrison, if what you're saying is true, this isn't just financial manipulation anymore. I know. This is criminal. I stared into the darkness. Can we prove it? Robert hesitated. Maybe, but we're going to need more evidence. The next morning, another surprise arrived. While organizing old files in the basement, I discovered a folder hidden behind several storage boxes. My name was written on the front. Curious, I opened it. Inside were pages of handwritten notes documenting my supposed memory failures. Dates, times, incidents. Most of them were completely fabricated. Some described events that never happened. Others exaggerated harmless mistakes into serious concerns. At the bottom of several pages appeared a familiar signature. Valerie's. I felt physically ill. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't concern. It was documentation. Someone was creating a paper trail designed to convince doctors, lawyers, and judges that I could no longer manage my own affairs. Then I reached the final page. Attached to it was a business card from a legal guardianship specialist. Beneath the card, written in Valerie's handwriting, were 7 words that changed everything. Need more evidence before moving forward. I read the sentence 3 times. Then 4. Moving forward with what? I already knew the answer. They weren't merely planning to take control of my finances. They were planning to take control of my life, my home, my freedom, my future. For the first time since this nightmare began, I stopped thinking like a father. I stopped making excuses for Valerie. I stopped hoping there was a misunderstanding, because fathers protect their children. But children do not secretly medicate their fathers, falsify medical concerns, and prepare legal documents to strip them of independence. The woman upstairs was no longer acting like my daughter. She was acting like someone who viewed me as an obstacle standing between her and something she wanted. And if that was true, then I needed to stop defending myself and start preparing for war. The very next morning, I scheduled a private meeting with attorney Mitchell Ross. By the time that meeting ended, Valerie and Derek would have no idea how quickly the game was about to change. The toxicology report sat on my desk for nearly an hour after I returned home. I must have read it 20 times. Each time, the words seemed more unbelievable. Antipsychotic medication, memory impairment, confusion, cognitive decline. Everything Valerie and Derek had been describing for weeks could be artificially created by the very pills they were encouraging me to take. The realization should have shocked me. Instead, it brought a strange sense of clarity. For months, I had been treating every suspicious event as an isolated incident. Now I could finally see the entire picture. They weren't waiting for me to lose control of my life. They were actively trying to make it happen. That evening, Valerie appeared at my basement door, carrying another blue pill and a glass of water. Her smile was warm and practiced. "Don't forget your medication, Dad." I looked at her face carefully. There was no hesitation, no guilt, no sign that she believed she was doing something wrong. That frightened me more than anger would have. I pretended to swallow the pill and thanked her. As soon as she left, I added it to the growing collection hidden inside my workbench. I now had enough samples to establish a pattern. The next morning, I met attorney Mitchell Ross for the first time. His office overlooked the river downtown. After listening to my story for nearly an hour, he leaned back in his chair and remained silent. Finally, he asked one question. "Do you want to protect your assets, or do you want to stop them completely?" It was a surprisingly difficult question. Several weeks earlier, I would have answered differently. Back then, I still wanted to believe my daughter could be saved from whatever influence Derek had over her. Now I wasn't so sure. "I want the truth," I said. Mitchell nodded. "Then we start collecting evidence." I handed him the toxicology report. His expression darkened immediately. "This is serious." "How serious?" Mitchell folded the report and placed it on his desk. "If someone knowingly administers medication to create the appearance of mental decline, we're not discussing family disagreements anymore. We're discussing fraud, abuse, and potentially criminal conspiracy." The word conspiracy lingered in my mind during the drive home, because that was exactly what this felt like. Not random greed, not isolated manipulation, a coordinated plan. Over the next week, Mitchell helped me quietly secure every major financial account I owned. We changed passwords, established monitoring alerts, and transferred several key assets into legal structures that could not be accessed without my direct approval. Valerie and Derek knew nothing about it. Meanwhile, I continued playing my role. If they wanted an elderly man losing his memory, I would give them one. I intentionally asked the same questions twice. I occasionally misplaced harmless items. I even pretended to forget the day of the week once or twice. The results were immediate. Valerie became more confident. Derek became careless. One afternoon, I overheard them discussing me in the kitchen. "It's definitely getting worse," Derek said. Valerie sounded relieved. "Good. That makes everything easier." Easier. Not sad. Not unfortunate. Easier. The conversation told me everything I needed to know. 2 days later, Robert called with an update on Dr. Eris. "You're going to want to hear this." I closed my office door and listened carefully. Over the last 6 years, Eris has been involved in multiple guardianship evaluations. "What kind of evaluations?" I asked. Robert hesitated. "Cases involving elderly individuals declared mentally incompetent." My stomach tightened. "How many?" "At least 14 that we can verify." 14. The number hit me hard. Robert continued. "Most are legitimate, but a few raised concerns. Family disputes, asset transfers, complaints that never went anywhere." I stared at the wall. "You're telling me this isn't the first time?" "I'm telling you the pattern deserves attention." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those 14 cases. Were there other families? Other elderly people who trusted the wrong person? Other fathers sitting alone in their homes, wondering why their memories suddenly seemed unreliable? The possibility was disturbing. The following afternoon, another clue arrived unexpectedly. Valerie left her laptop open on the dining room table while she answered a phone call. Normally, I would never invade someone's privacy. Under different circumstances, I would have walked away. These were not different circumstances. As I passed the table, I noticed a calendar reminder displayed on the screen. One entry immediately caught my attention. Consultation, capacity review. The appointment was scheduled 3 weeks away. Beneath it appeared another note. Prepare documentation package. My pulse accelerated. Documentation package. Capacity review. Combined with the fake medical records, the surveillance cameras, and the medication, the meaning was obvious. They were preparing something official, something legal, something designed to convince another person that I was incapable of managing my own life. I quietly memorized the date before leaving the room. That evening, I called Mitchell. After hearing the details, he became unusually serious. "Harrison, we may be running out of time." "Why?" "Because capacity reviews are often the first step." "First step toward what?" The silence on the other end of the line lasted several seconds. Then Mitchell finally answered. "Guardianship proceedings." The words landed like a hammer. Guardianship. A legal process allowing someone else to control finances, medical decisions, property, and daily life. Suddenly, the senior care brochure made perfect sense. The medication made sense. The cameras made sense. Every piece finally fit together. They weren't trying to inherit from me someday. They were trying to take control while I was still alive. Later that night, as I walked past the upstairs hallway, I heard Valerie speaking softly on the phone. I couldn't hear the entire conversation. Only one sentence that sent a chill down my spine. "Once the evaluation is done, everything moves forward." I stood frozen in the darkness. Evaluation. Everything moves forward. Whatever they were planning, the countdown had already begun. And for the first time since this nightmare started, I realized something terrifying. They weren't thinking about doing it anymore. They had already chosen the date. I barely slept after hearing Valerie's phone call. "Once the evaluation is done, everything moves forward." Those words echoed through my head until sunrise. By now, the pattern was impossible to ignore. The medication, the missing bank statements, the fake memory problems, the cameras, the capacity review. None of these things were random. They were pieces of a carefully designed machine, and that machine was moving toward a single goal. The only question left was how close they were to finishing it. The answer arrived 3 days later. Robert called just after lunch. His voice was tense. "I found something." I immediately closed my office door. "What is it?" Valerie and Derek attended 3 meetings over the last month. My stomach tightened. With who? A guardianship attorney, a geriatric psychiatrist, and a representative from a long-term care facility. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Robert continued, I have photographs, dates, and location records. I slowly lowered myself into my chair. Everything Mitchell suspected was true. They weren't considering their options anymore. They were actively preparing to remove me from my own life. Did they mention me directly? I asked. Multiple times. Robert paused. Harrison, they're building a case. I stared out the window at the backyard where Valerie used to play as a child. The swing set was gone now. The garden my wife loved was gone too. Somehow that felt symbolic. One piece at a time, everything I cared about seemed to disappear. There's more, Robert said. My chest tightened. Go ahead. The care facility has already reserved a room. I felt as if someone had punched me in the stomach. A room? Yes. His voice remained calm. Private suite, long-term residency. Long-term residency. Such polite words for what they were really planning. Exile, isolation, removal. They wanted to place me somewhere out of sight, where they could control everything I owned, while convincing the world it was for my own good. That evening, I met Mitchell and Robert at a private conference room downtown. The table quickly filled with documents, photographs, receipts, appointment logs, and surveillance reports. For the first time, I saw the entire operation laid out in front of me. Mitchell pointed to the timeline. The medication began approximately 4 months ago. He moved to another section. The financial transfers accelerated shortly afterward. Then another section. The guardianship consultation started 6 weeks ago. Finally, he tapped the last entry. Capacity review scheduled in 18 days. The room became silent. 18 days. That was all that stood between me and whatever nightmare they had planned. Mitchell folded his arms. The good news is that we have evidence. And the bad news? I asked. We still don't know how much Valerie understands. Robert looked uncomfortable. Actually, we might. He slid a printed email across the table. The message was between Valerie and the guardianship attorney. I read every word slowly. By the time I reached the end, my hands were shaking. Valerie wasn't being manipulated. Valerie wasn't confused. Valerie wasn't trapped. She was directing parts of the operation herself. Several recommendations had come from her. Several meetings had been arranged by her. One sentence in particular felt like a knife through my chest. Dad trusts me completely, so obtaining the necessary cooperation shouldn't be difficult. I read it again. Then again, trusts me completely. The daughter I had spent my life protecting had weaponized that trust against me. Mitchell finally broke the silence. I'm sorry, Harrison. I stared at the email. No. My voice sounded strangely calm. At least now I know. For weeks, I had been searching for excuses. Maybe Derek was controlling her. Maybe she didn't understand what was happening. Maybe she was scared. The email destroyed every excuse. This wasn't Derek's plan anymore. It was their plan. When I returned home that night, Valerie was waiting in the kitchen. Dad, where were you? She asked. I smiled. Just running errands. She studied me carefully. You seem tired lately. The irony was almost unbearable. Maybe I'm getting old. She nodded sympathetically. That's normal. Then she placed another blue pill beside my dinner plate. Don't forget this. I looked at the pill for a moment before pretending to swallow it. Across the table, Derek watched me with quiet satisfaction. They believed they were winning. That confidence would become their biggest mistake. 2 days later, another opportunity appeared. While Valerie was shopping and Derek was at work, I entered the upstairs office they shared. Robert had discovered that many of their planning documents were stored there. I had less than 15 minutes before Valerie returned. Working quickly, I searched drawers, cabinets, and file boxes. Most contained ordinary paperwork. Then I found a locked folder. Fortunately, the key was hidden nearby. Inside was everything. Medical notes, financial summaries, guardianship drafts, facility agreements, capacity review preparations, and one document that made my blood run cold. The heading read, Transition Plan, Following Incompetency Determination. I sat down and began reading. The document outlined what would happen after I was declared mentally incompetent. My accounts would be transferred, my property would be managed by Valerie, My access to funds would be restricted. My residence would change. My personal decisions would require approval. Every aspect of my independence would disappear. At the bottom was a handwritten note, Derek's handwriting. Once he's moved, everything becomes much easier. I immediately photographed every page. Then I returned everything exactly as I found it. That evening, after everyone went to bed, I sat alone in the darkness reviewing the evidence. The room reservation, the legal meetings, the medication, the transition plan. They had spent months preparing my future without ever asking my permission. But hidden among the documents was one detail they never expected me to find: a date. A specific date. The date they planned to submit the final guardianship petition. 14 days from now. I stared at the number for a long time. 14 days. Suddenly, the countdown became real. For months, I had been reacting to their moves. Now, I finally knew their schedule, their deadline, their end game. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized something important. They thought they were hunting a helpless old man. In reality, they had just handed their target a complete copy of the battle plan. After I found the date of the final guardianship petition, everything inside me became quiet. Not peaceful, quiet. There is a difference. Peace comes when a man feels safe. Quiet comes when a man has accepted that the people he loves have become dangerous. I sat at my basement desk until nearly 3 in the morning, staring at the photographs of the transition plan on my phone. 14 days. That was how much time Valerie and Derek believed they had before they could legally remove my freedom, my finances, and my voice. They had a doctor. They had a lawyer. They had fabricated notes. They had cameras angled at my supposed decline. They even had a room reserved at a long-term care facility. What they did not have was the truth. And the truth was about to start recording everything. The next morning, I called Mitchell from the prepaid phone hidden beneath my workbench. "We need audio," I told him. "Not just documents." Mitchell did not argue. I was going to suggest the same thing. By noon, Robert had arranged for a private security technician named Caleb to meet me at a hardware store parking lot 20 miles away. Caleb looked like an ordinary contractor, but the equipment in his black case was anything but ordinary. Tiny microphones, miniature cameras, encrypted transmitters, devices small enough to disappear inside vents, light fixtures, and smoke detector housings. "This has to be legal," I said before he opened the case. Caleb looked at Mitchell, then back at me. "Your attorney already explained the limits. We install only in areas of the house where you have ownership rights and where you are legally permitted to record for your protection. No bedrooms, no bathrooms, no private spaces." I nodded. Good. I wanted justice, not shortcuts. Shortcuts were what Valerie and Derek used. That evening, Valerie and Derek attended a charity dinner downtown. They believed I had swallowed my medication and gone to sleep early. In reality, I watched their car disappear down the driveway, waited 5 minutes, then opened the side garage door for Caleb and Robert. We moved quickly. For the first time in months, the house felt like mine again. Caleb installed one audio device behind the living room fireplace vent, where Valerie and Derek often whispered after dinner. Another went inside a decorative wall clock near the kitchen. A third was placed in my own basement sitting area, because I needed proof of what they said to me directly. Robert photographed the placement of each device for Mitchell's files. I stood beside them, studying every angle like an engineer reviewing load-bearing points. "They installed cameras to watch me," I said quietly. Robert looked up. "Then we document them watching themselves." By the time Valerie and Derek returned, the house looked untouched. I was in my recliner, wrapped in a blanket, pretending to doze. Valerie came downstairs carrying another blue pill. "Dad?" she whispered. I opened my eyes slowly. "Just your medicine." I pretended to be confused. "Did I already take it?" Her face softened with fake pity. "No, sweetheart. That's why I'm here." Sweetheart. She had not called me that sincerely in years. I pretended to swallow the pill. She watched my throat carefully, then smiled. "Good, you'll feel better soon." As she walked away, the tiny microphone in the basement captured every word. The next 2 days were uneventful, and that almost made things worse. Waiting for evidence is harder than finding it. I continued my performance. I misplaced my glasses. I asked Derek the same question twice. I called Valerie by my late wife's name once, and the excitement in her eyes nearly made me sick. She did not look frightened. She looked encouraged. Then on the third night, the first real recording arrived. Mitchell called me just before midnight. "Harrison," he said, "you need to hear this." He played the audio through the secure line. Valerie's voice came first, clear as glass from the living room microphone. "Once he's declared incompetent, everything becomes simple." Derek laughed softly. "Simple is the point. Right now, he can still object. After the court signs off, he can't object to anything." My hand tightened around the phone. Valerie asked, "And the accounts?" Derek answered, "Frozen under our control until we transfer what we need." "What about the house?" "Same thing. If he's in care, nobody questions why we manage the property." Valerie was silent for a moment. Then she said, "I don't want him making a scene." Derek's answer was immediate. "He won't. Eris said the medication will keep him manageable by then." Manageable. Not healthy, not safe, manageable. I closed my eyes, feeling the last warmth of fatherhood harden into something cold and sharp. Mitchell stopped the playback. "That's enough for now." "No," I said. "Play the rest." He hesitated. Then the audio resumed. Valerie whispered, "Sometimes I still feel strange about it." For one brief second, my heart moved. Maybe a trace of guilt still existed. Maybe the daughter I remembered was buried somewhere under the greed. Then Derek said, "About what?" Valerie replied, "About waiting so long." The words struck harder than any insult. She was not guilty about what she was doing. She was impatient that it had taken this much time. Derek laughed. "2 more weeks, Val." Then the old man becomes paperwork. I sat there in the darkness holding the phone to my ear while my daughter reduced my life to a file on a lawyer's desk. Paperwork. That was what I had become to her. Not a father, not a widower, not the man who paid for her education, held her hand through every crisis, and sold pieces of his own future to build hers. Paperwork. The following morning, I walked upstairs and found Valerie arranging flowers in the dining room. She smiled at me. "Good morning, Dad. You look rested." I looked at the woman who had called me paperwork less than 8 hours earlier. "I slept well," I said. "Good." She touched my arm. "Derek and I were thinking we should take you to see Dr. Eris next week. Just a little checkup, if you think it's best." Her smile widened. "I do." That afternoon, Robert sent photographs from another surveillance job. Valerie and Derek had entered the county courthouse with their guardianship attorney. They stayed for 42 minutes. When they left, Derek looked cheerful. Valerie looked nervous, but determined. The caption beneath the final photograph said, "Preliminary filing inquiry confirmed." My pulse slowed. Not because I was calm, but because all uncertainty was gone. They were no longer planning. They were moving. That night, the living room microphone captured the sentence that pushed everything into the next phase. Valerie said, "The court clerk said once Eris signs the final report, we can file immediately." Derek replied, "Then make sure your father takes every pill." I sat alone in my basement with the blue tablets hidden in a cigar box beside my desk, listening to the people upstairs celebrate the success of a poison I had never swallowed. For the first time, I allowed myself to smile, because now we had their voices, their intent, their timeline, their doctor, their plan. They thought the walls were protecting their secrets. They had no idea the walls had finally started talking back. The recordings changed everything. For weeks, I had been chasing suspicions. Now I had proof. Valerie and Derek were no longer just people I distrusted. They were conspirators caught in their own words. Yet Mitchell warned me not to celebrate too early. "Intent is powerful," he said during our next meeting. "But motive is even better. We need to know exactly why they're doing this and how desperate they really are." I thought I already knew the answer. Money, greed, control. It seemed obvious. Robert disagreed. "People don't usually risk prison unless they're protecting something bigger." 2 days later, he proved he was right. Robert called shortly after noon. I found Derek's real problem. His voice carried the same tone detectives use when they know a case has just changed. "Meet me at my office." 30 minutes later, I sat across from him while he opened a thick folder. "Everything started with debt," he said, but it didn't stay there. He slid several financial statements toward me. At first, the numbers meant nothing. Then I noticed the balances: credit cards, personal loans, business loans, private lenders. The totals climbed higher and higher with every page. By the time I reached the end, Derek owed nearly $1.8 million. I looked up. How is that possible? Robert shook his head. Bad investments. Gambling disguised as investing. Luxury spending. And a lifestyle he couldn't afford. Then came another stack. Hotel receipts, airline records, jewelry purchases, condominium payments in Miami. Most were connected to Melissa Carter, the woman I had seen him kissing outside the restaurant. Derek wasn't simply having an affair. He was funding an entirely separate life. I felt sick, not because of the money, because of what it meant. Every lie, every fake illness, every manipulation, it had all been driven by desperation. Derek wasn't trying to get rich, he was trying to avoid collapse. Then Robert handed me the worst document yet. It was a text conversation. Melissa had asked when Derek was finally leaving Valerie. Derek replied that everything would happen soon, once the old man's assets were secured. Melissa complained that he had been making the same promise for months. Derek answered that the guardianship was almost complete, and that money would no longer be a problem afterward. I stared at the messages in silence. The old man. That was me. Not Harrison, not Dad, not Grandpa. Just the old man. Robert pointed toward another section of the conversation. Melissa asked what would happen if Valerie discovered the affair. Derek's answer was immediate. Valerie already knew. I felt the air leave my lungs. Valerie knows? I asked quietly. Robert nodded. Keep reading. My hands felt numb as I continued. Melissa asked if Valerie was really okay with everything. Derek replied that she wanted the inheritance just as much as he did. The words hit harder than any evidence I had seen so far. Not because Derek claimed it, because Robert had already verified it through emails, bank transfers, and meeting records. Valerie knew. Valerie wasn't being manipulated. Valerie wasn't trapped. Valerie wasn't a victim. She was a willing partner. The drive home felt endless. For months, I had searched for a reason to save my daughter in my mind. Some explanation that would separate her from Derek's influence. Now that possibility was gone. When I entered the house, Valerie was helping Leo with homework at the dining room table. For a brief moment, she looked exactly like the daughter I remembered. Patient, gentle, smiling. Then she noticed me watching. "Everything okay, Dad?" she asked. I forced a smile. "Just tired." She stood and hugged me. The hug nearly broke me, because I realized the person embracing me was no longer the daughter I had raised. That daughter had disappeared long ago. After dinner, I retreated to the basement and reviewed the newest evidence with Mitchell. He listened carefully before speaking. "Harrison, there's something else." I looked up. "What?" He handed me another report. Several of Derek's lenders had already begun legal action. 2 lawsuits were pending. One creditor had obtained a judgment. Another was preparing asset recovery proceedings. I read every page slowly. Then I saw the date. The largest payment was due in less than 3 weeks, the same 3-week period connected to the guardianship filing. Suddenly, everything made sense. They weren't simply trying to control my money. They needed it immediately. Without access to my assets, Derek's financial life would implode. The guardianship wasn't just greed. It was survival. For him. The next evening brought another breakthrough. The living room microphone activated automatically at 10:17 p.m. Mitchell forwarded the recording before midnight. I sat alone listening through headphones. Derek's voice came first. "We can't delay anymore." Valerie sounded nervous. "I know. If the filing doesn't happen this month, everything falls apart." "What about the lawsuits?" Derek cursed softly. "That's exactly what I'm talking about." Several seconds passed before Valerie asked the question that changed the entire case. "What if he finds out?" Derek laughed. The sound chilled me. "By the time he figures it out, he'll be living in that facility." Silence followed. Then Valerie whispered something so quietly I almost missed it. "What if we should have done this years ago?" I froze. Years ago. Not months. Not recently. Years. The conspiracy hadn't started when Derek got desperate. It had been growing far longer than I imagined, and if that was true, there were still secrets buried beneath everything we had already uncovered. Secrets capable of making this betrayal even worse. The following morning, Robert called before sunrise. His voice sounded different. Not excited, not satisfied. Disturbed. "Harrison," he said, I found something connected to Valerie. My stomach tightened. What kind of something? The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then he answered. Something that proves she wasn't just helping Derek. It proves the entire plan may have been her idea from the beginning. The sun had not even risen when I arrived at Robert's office. His message had kept me awake most of the night. Something that proves the entire plan may have been her idea from the beginning. I must have replayed those words 100 times during the drive. Every mile felt heavier than the last. For weeks, I had been uncovering evidence that Valerie was involved. I knew she had lied. I knew she had manipulated me. I knew she had helped Derek build a case against me. But somewhere deep inside, a small part of me still believed Derek had started all of this. A small part of me still wanted to believe my daughter had simply followed the wrong person. Robert destroyed that illusion within 10 minutes. He placed a thin folder on the table between us. Unlike the thick financial reports and surveillance files I had reviewed before, this one looked almost insignificant, yet Robert's expression told me otherwise. Everything inside this folder predates Derek's financial collapse, he said. My chest tightened. How much earlier? Nearly 4 years. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Derek's debt crisis had exploded less than 2 years ago. If Robert was right, the plan had existed long before the financial emergency. Show me. Robert opened the folder and slid the first document across the desk. It was an email. The sender was Valerie. The recipient was a financial advisor. The date was almost 4 years old. I read the message once, then again, then a third time. Valerie wasn't asking about retirement planning. She wasn't asking about estate management. She was asking how difficult it would be to gain control of a parent's assets if that parent became mentally incompetent. My hands slowly tightened around the paper. Robert pushed another document toward me, then another, then another. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Over several years, Valerie had consulted lawyers, financial planners, elder care specialists, and estate professionals. The questions were always similar: guardianship, asset control, medical authority, long-term care placement. None of it involved Derek. None of it mentioned financial hardship. This wasn't a desperate solution to a recent problem. This was a long-term strategy. I sat back in my chair and stared at the wall. The room suddenly felt cold. She started this before Derek's debt? Robert nodded. Years before. The realization hurt more than anything I had discovered so far. Every previous betrayal allowed me to blame circumstances. Debt, greed, bad influence, desperation. Those explanations were gone now. Valerie had been planning for my removal long before she had a reason to. Then Robert handed me the document that shattered whatever remained of my heart. It was a journal entry, not a diary exactly. More like a personal note, saved in an old cloud account. Valerie had written it almost 3 years earlier. Most of the entry discussed frustration, complaints about caring for family, complaints about responsibilities, complaints about feeling trapped. Then I reached the final paragraph. The words burned into my memory instantly. Dad still controls everything. The house, the accounts, the decisions. Sometimes I feel like my life can't fully begin until he's no longer in charge. I closed my eyes. Not because I was angry, because I was exhausted. For 70 years, I had believed sacrifice was the foundation of family. Work hard, protect your children, give them opportunities you never had, put their future ahead of your own. My entire life had been built on those principles. Yet somehow, my daughter had interpreted every sacrifice as an obstacle. Everything I provided had become something she resented. Robert remained silent while I absorbed the information. Finally, I asked the question I had been avoiding. Did she ever love me? Robert looked uncomfortable. Harrison. I raised a hand. Just answer honestly. He thought for several seconds. I think she loved you once. The answer hurt because it sounded true. Once. Past tense. Whatever relationship we once had no longer existed. Then Robert showed me the final piece. It was an audio recording recovered from Valerie's old phone backup. The recording was nearly 18 months old, long before the medication, long before the cameras, long before the guardianship process accelerated. Valerie was speaking with Derek. Dad won't give up control voluntarily, she said. Derek asked what she planned to do. Valerie laughed softly. Then she answered, People believe doctors. People believe paperwork. People believe evidence. We just need enough of all three. My blood ran cold. There it was, the origin of everything. Not Derek's idea, not financial desperation. Valerie's plan. The blueprint had existed from the very beginning. Derek had simply become a willing partner. I left Robert's office shortly before noon. During the drive home, something inside me finally changed. For months, every new discovery had brought heartbreak. This one brought something different. Acceptance. The daughter I had been trying to save no longer existed. Perhaps she hadn't existed for years. The woman living in my house was someone else entirely. Someone capable of patiently building a strategy to steal my independence while smiling at me across the dinner table. That evening, Valerie greeted me at the door. "How was your day?" she asked. I looked directly into her eyes. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt no confusion, no hope, no doubt, only certainty. "Productive," I answered. She smiled. "That's good." Then she handed me another blue pill. I accepted it without hesitation. Across the room, Derek watched with quiet satisfaction. Neither of them realized their greatest advantage had just disappeared. They believed I was still fighting to understand what was happening. In reality, the investigation phase was over. I now knew who had started the conspiracy. I knew why it existed. I knew how they planned to execute it. Most importantly, I knew exactly when they intended to strike. The final guardianship filing was only days away. Valerie and Derek believed they were approaching victory. What they didn't know was that Mitchell had spent the last week preparing a counterattack capable of destroying everything they had built, and the first move would happen in less than 48 hours. The countdown had begun. 14 days had become 10. 10 had become 7. Now only 3 days remained before Valerie and Derek planned to submit the final guardianship petition. For months, they had prepared every detail. The medication, the fabricated records, the financial manipulation, the meetings with lawyers and doctors, the room waiting at the care facility. Every piece was in place. And for the first time since this nightmare started, I realized something terrifying. If Mitchell, Robert, and I made even a single mistake, the court might see their version of me before it ever saw the truth. 3 days before the filing date, Valerie approached me at breakfast, carrying a folder. She looked nervous but determined. "Dad," she said softly, "there's something we need to discuss." I glanced at the folder and immediately recognized the expression on her face. It was the same expression she wore as a child whenever she wanted something she knew she shouldn't ask for. "What is it?" I asked. She sat down across from me. "You've been struggling lately." I nearly laughed. Not because it was funny, because after everything she had done, she could still say the words with a straight face. "Have I?" I asked quietly. Valerie nodded. "Your memory, your confusion, the accidents." Derek entered the kitchen at exactly the right moment, almost as if they had rehearsed the conversation. "We're worried about you, Harrison. Worried." The word sounded ridiculous coming from the people creating the problem. Valerie opened the folder. Inside were copies of the false notes, fabricated incidents, and medical observations they had spent months collecting. "We think it's time to consider professional care." I looked down at the papers and forced my hands to tremble slightly. If they wanted weakness, I would give them weakness. "You want to send me away?" Valerie immediately shook her head. "No, Dad. We want to help you. Help me, the same way a wolf helps a sheep." I lowered my eyes and remained silent. After several uncomfortable seconds, Valerie reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You don't have to decide today." But we both knew she was lying. The decision had already been made. That afternoon, I met Mitchell in a secure conference room. He reviewed the latest recordings while I explained the breakfast conversation. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "They're accelerating." "I know." Mitchell leaned forward. "That's actually good news." I frowned. "How?" "Because desperate people make mistakes." He opened a folder and handed me a document. The heading immediately caught my attention. Capacity Evaluation Request. My pulse quickened. They already filed it? Not officially. Mitchell pointed toward a signature line. But the paperwork has been prepared. I studied the pages carefully. Then I saw the name. Dr. Aris. The same doctor connected to the medication. The same doctor connected to multiple questionable guardianship cases. My jaw tightened. "Can we stop him?" Mitchell smiled slightly. "We don't need to stop him." "What do you mean?" "We need him to commit." I stared at him. "Commit to what?" Mitchell slid another document across the table. It was a legal affidavit prepared by a medical ethics investigator working with our team. Suddenly, I understood. Doctor. Aris believed he was helping build a case against me. In reality, every report he signed was creating evidence against himself. For the first time in weeks, I felt a small spark of optimism. The next evening, the living room microphone captured another conversation. Valerie sounded anxious. "What if the evaluation doesn't go well?" Derek answered immediately. Aris already knows what to write. Silence followed. Then Valerie asked the question that made my blood run cold. "And the facility?" Derek laughed softly. "The room is already reserved." Reserved. Not requested. Not considered. Reserved. They weren't planning for a possibility anymore. They were planning for an arrival. My arrival. The following morning, Robert called before sunrise. "You need to hear this." His voice sounded urgent. Within an hour, I was sitting across from him, reviewing new surveillance photographs. The images showed Valerie and Derek entering the nursing facility. One photograph showed them speaking with an administrator. Another showed them touring a private room. Then came the final image. Valerie standing beside the bed, smiling. My stomach turned. They were decorating my future prison before I had even been declared incompetent. Robert placed another photograph on the table. "Look at the date." I checked the timestamp. 2 days from now. The same day as my evaluation. Everything had been coordinated. The doctor, the attorney, the facility, the filing, the transfer. Every step was scheduled with military precision. By the time I returned home that evening, I knew the next 48 hours would determine everything. Valerie greeted me with unusual warmth. She cooked my favorite dinner. She asked about old family memories. She even brought out photo albums from happier years. For a moment, the performance was almost convincing. Almost. Then she said something that revealed the truth. "Dad, no matter what happens this week, just remember we're doing what's best for you." I looked directly into her eyes. She genuinely expected me to believe that. That was the frightening part. Somewhere along the way, Valerie had convinced herself that greed was concern, control was love, betrayal was protection. I smiled sadly. Of course. That night, I sat alone in the basement reviewing every piece of evidence we had gathered. The recordings, the financial records, the medication reports, the emails, the surveillance photographs, months of lies reduced to boxes and folders. Then my phone vibrated. It was a message from Mitchell, only 6 words. "The evaluation is tomorrow morning." I stared at the screen for a long time. Tomorrow, the day they had spent months preparing for. The day they believed would give them control over my life. Upstairs, Valerie and Derek slept peacefully, convinced victory was only hours away. Neither of them realized that while they were preparing to prove I was incapable of protecting myself, Mitchell was preparing something far more dangerous. Because tomorrow, for the first time, Dr. Aris would be forced to answer questions under oath. I woke up before dawn on the morning of the evaluation. For months, Valerie and Derek had been moving toward this day. Every lie, every fake medical note, every missing bank statement, every blue pill, every conversation about my supposed confusion had been designed to lead here. If Dr. Aris declared me mentally incompetent, Valerie could file the guardianship petition almost immediately. The court process would begin. My accounts could be frozen. My independence could disappear. Everything depended on what happened over the next few hours. Strangely, I felt calm. Not because I wasn't afraid, because for the first time, I wasn't walking into their trap alone. Mitchell had spent weeks preparing for this moment. Robert had gathered evidence. Independent specialists had reviewed the medication. Financial investigators had traced the missing money. The difference was simple. Valerie and Derek believed they were bringing paperwork. We were bringing the truth. At exactly 9 o'clock, Valerie drove me to Dr. Aris's office. She spent the entire ride acting concerned. "Just answer honestly," she said. "Nobody is judging you." I almost admired the performance. Almost. When we arrived, Derek was already waiting in the lobby. The two of them exchanged a quick glance. They probably thought I didn't notice. The look said everything. Excitement, confidence, expectation. They believed the finish line was finally within reach. Dr. Aris greeted us personally. His smile was professional and reassuring. "Good morning, Harrison." I shook his hand. "Good morning, doctor." He led us into a consultation room and closed the door behind us. For the next 40 minutes, he asked questions designed to evaluate memory, judgment, and cognitive function. What day was it? Who was the current president? What year did I retire? What city was I born in? I answered every question correctly. Each answer seemed to irritate him slightly. Eventually, he began asking more subjective questions. Do you ever feel confused? Occasionally. Do you manage your finances alone? I hesitated deliberately. Sometimes Valerie helps. Dr. Eris made a note. Valerie smiled faintly. The trap was obvious. Every answer would be interpreted in the way most helpful to them. Fortunately, Mitchell expected exactly that. The evaluation ended shortly before 10. As Valerie and Derek escorted me toward the parking lot, both appeared relieved. Dr. Aris had not openly declared me incompetent, but neither had he indicated any concern about the medication or the suspicious circumstances. They believed everything remained on schedule. What they didn't know was that Mitchell had spent the morning launching a counterattack. At noon, we met privately in his office. The moment I walked inside, I knew something significant had happened. Mitchell looked more energized than I had seen him in months. How did it go? I asked. He smiled. Better than expected. He handed me several documents. The first was a temporary financial protection order covering my major accounts. The second established additional legal barriers preventing unauthorized transfers. The third was even more important, an official request for an independent neurological evaluation performed by a nationally recognized specialist. I looked up. What does this do? Mitchell leaned forward. It creates conflict. Conflict? If Eris claims you're incompetent but an independent expert disagrees, the court must examine both opinions. For the first time in weeks, I felt genuine hope. Mitchell continued. And that's not all. He opened another folder. Inside were records connected to Dr. Eris's previous guardianship cases, complaints, settlement agreements, professional reviews, cases that never reached public attention. Individually, none of them proved wrongdoing. Together, they formed a disturbing pattern. Robert found all this? I asked. Mitchell nodded. And we're still digging. That afternoon brought another surprise. One of Derek's creditors filed an emergency motion seeking recovery of outstanding debts. The timing couldn't have been worse for him. If the guardianship process stalled, his financial problems would become public before he gained access to any of my assets. Desperation was beginning to close around him from every direction. That evening, the living room microphone delivered exactly what Mitchell had hoped for. Valerie sounded anxious. How long until Eris finishes the report? Derek answered immediately. A day or two. And then we file? Immediately. Several seconds passed. Then Valerie asked the question that revealed just how nervous she really was. What if the court orders another evaluation? Derek laughed. It won't matter. How do you know? Because Eris already knows what conclusion they're expecting. I listened to the recording 3 times. Then I sent it directly to Mitchell. Less than 10 minutes later, my phone rang. That's it, he said. That's what we needed. Why? Because he just connected the medical conclusion to the desired legal outcome. I smiled for the first time all day. Derek thought he was reassuring Valerie. In reality, he had handed us another piece of evidence. The next morning, things became even worse for them. Robert discovered communications between Dr. Eris and the guardianship attorney discussing timelines before the evaluation had even occurred. Nothing explicitly illegal, but enough to raise serious ethical concerns. The appearance of coordination alone could damage their entire case. Meanwhile, Valerie and Derek remained completely unaware. They spent the day discussing moving arrangements, financial transfers, and future plans as though victory had already been secured. By evening, they were talking about my removal from the house as a certainty rather than a possibility. Around 10 o'clock, another recording arrived. Derek sounded unusually confident. In less than 2 weeks, this whole thing is over. Valerie laughed softly. I can't wait. I closed my eyes. 2 weeks. They still believed they had 2 weeks left. What they didn't realize was that Mitchell had just filed a legal notice requiring Dr. Eris to provide supporting documentation for every medical opinion he intended to submit, every prescription, every note, every observation, every recommendation. For the first time, someone was forcing him to explain his actions under scrutiny. And according to Mitchell, people who build false narratives rarely perform well when every detail must be defended. Just before midnight, another message arrived from him. This one was shorter than usual. 4 words. 4 words that made my pulse quicken immediately. Eris is getting nervous. Suddenly, I understood something important. For months, Valerie and Derek had believed I was the weakest person involved in this story. Then they believed Dr. Aris was their strongest ally. They were wrong on both counts. Because when people begin making mistakes under pressure, entire conspiracies can collapse faster than anyone expects. And based on what Mitchell had just discovered, Dr. Aris was about to make a very expensive mistake. 3 days after the evaluation, Valerie and Derek began acting differently. The nervousness that had followed Dr. Aris's appointment was disappearing. Confidence was returning. They smiled more. They whispered less. They spent hours behind closed doors, discussing plans for the future. To anyone else, it might have looked harmless. To me, it looked like people who believed victory was finally within reach. The reason became clear on Thursday afternoon. Valerie appeared at my basement door carrying a thick folder and the same sympathetic expression she had practiced for months. "Dad, can we talk?" I looked up from my chair and nodded slowly. "Of course." She sat beside me and placed the folder on the table. "There's some paperwork we need to organize." I glanced at the documents: legal forms, financial authorizations, property management agreements. Several pages contained highlighted signature lines. My pulse remained steady. Mitchell had warned me this moment was coming. "What kind of paperwork?" I asked. Valerie sighed heavily. "Just precautionary documents. Nothing serious. Nothing serious." The phrase almost made me laugh. If signed, the papers would give her extraordinary influence over my finances while the guardianship process moved forward. She wasn't asking for permission. She was trying to create the appearance of cooperation. Derek entered the room a few moments later carrying coffee. The timing felt rehearsed. "We're only trying to make things easier for you, Harrison." Easier. There was that word again. Everything became easier when they took control. Easier when I lost authority. Easier when my future belonged to someone else. Valerie slid a pen across the table. "You don't have to read everything. We've already reviewed it with the attorney." I looked at the pen, then at the papers, then at my daughter. For a brief moment, I wondered if she truly believed her own lies, if she had repeated them so often that they now sounded reasonable in her own mind. I picked up the pen and slowly flipped through the documents. Most of the language was exactly what Mitchell expected: temporary authority, financial access, property oversight, emergency decision rights. Together, the papers formed a bridge between the evaluation and the full guardianship petition. One signature would make the next step significantly easier. Valerie watched me carefully. "Do you understand everything?" I pretended to hesitate. "Not completely." She immediately leaned forward. "That's okay. That's why we're helping." I lowered my eyes and nodded weakly. The performance was almost painful, not because I felt foolish, because she seemed genuinely pleased by my apparent confusion. Then I signed, page after page, line after line. Valerie's excitement became harder to hide with every signature. Derek looked like a man watching lottery numbers appear one at a time. Neither of them knew the truth. The pen Mitchell provided contained disappearing legal ink, designed specifically for document security demonstrations. Within 24 hours, every signature would gradually fade until nothing remained. The documents would appear valid long enough for Valerie and Derek to celebrate, long enough for them to expose their intentions, long enough for them to make mistakes. When the final page was complete, Valerie hugged me. "Thank you, Dad." Her voice sounded emotional. Derek smiled broadly. "You did the right thing." I smiled back. "I hope so." That evening, after they believed I had gone to sleep, the living room microphone recorded exactly what Mitchell predicted. Derek opened a bottle of champagne. I heard the cork pop through the recording. Valerie laughed. The sound made my stomach turn. "We're finally there," she said. Derek replied, "The hardest part is over." They spent the next 30 minutes discussing future plans. Not possibilities. Certainties. Derek talked about paying off debts. Valerie discussed renovating the house. They even argued about what furniture should remain after I moved into the facility. At one point, Valerie asked whether the basement would need to be cleaned out. Derek laughed. Not our problem much longer. I listened in silence while the people upstairs divided my life into categories and inventory lists. Yet something else happened during the conversation, something even more valuable than their celebration. Confidence made them careless. Derek began discussing timelines, specific timelines, lawsuits, transfers, accounts, future transactions, information he would never have revealed if he still felt threatened. Mitchell listened to the recordings later that night and smiled. They're talking like winners. Is that good? I asked. It's perfect. The next morning, Robert delivered another surprise. One of Derek's creditors had accelerated legal proceedings after discovering discrepancies in his financial disclosures. Several hidden liabilities were now under investigation. The pressure surrounding Derek was becoming unbearable, and desperate people rarely stay disciplined for long. By afternoon, another recording arrived. Valerie sounded excited. When do we tell Leo? Derek answered immediately. Not until after the filing. Why? Because children talk. I closed my eyes. Even now, they were using my grandson as another piece on the board. Protecting the plan mattered more than protecting the family. That realization removed the last traces of hesitation I still carried. The following morning, exactly 24 hours after the documents were signed, Valerie entered the home office carrying the folder. Moments later, I heard her scream. The sound echoed through the house. Derek came running. So did I. By the time I reached the room, both were staring at the documents in disbelief. Every signature line was blank. Every page appeared unsigned. Valerie flipped through the papers frantically. That's impossible. Derek grabbed another page, then another, then another. His face turned pale. What happened? Valerie looked terrified. I watched him sign them. For the first time in months, I saw genuine panic. Not concern, not frustration. Panic. The foundation beneath their plan had suddenly cracked. Derek looked ready to explode. Valerie looked ready to cry. Meanwhile, I stood quietly in the doorway, pretending to be confused. Is something wrong? Neither answered. Their eyes remained fixed on the disappearing signatures, because in that moment, they finally understood something they had never considered before. Maybe the old man wasn't as helpless as they thought. And upstairs, hidden inside a secure folder, Mitchell had just received another recording. One that captured every second of their panic and would soon become one of the most valuable pieces of evidence in the entire case. The scream from Valerie's office marked the beginning of the collapse. For months, she and Derek had moved through the house with quiet confidence, convinced that every hallway, every camera, every document, and every conversation belonged to them. Now, for the first time, they looked afraid inside the life they had stolen from me. The blank signature pages lay scattered across the glass desk like evidence of a miracle they could not explain. Valerie kept flipping through them, her hands shaking. I watched him sign, she whispered. I watched him sign every page. Derek grabbed the folder from her and searched through it again, as if the signatures might somehow reappear if he turned the pages fast enough. This isn't possible. I stood in the doorway with my shoulders slightly bent, still wearing the mask of confusion. Did I do something wrong? Valerie looked at me sharply, and for one dangerous second, I thought the mask on her own face might finally fall away completely. Then she caught herself. No, Dad, she said, forcing calm into her voice. Everything is fine. It was not fine. Nothing was fine anymore. Derek slammed the folder shut and stepped toward me. Did you change pens? I blinked slowly. Pens? The pen you used yesterday. Where is it? Valerie turned toward him quickly. Derek. He ignored her. Where is the pen, Harrison? His voice carried too much anger now, too much desperation. I allowed my mouth to tremble. I don't remember. Derek's jaw tightened so hard I could see the muscle move in his cheek. For a moment, I saw the real man beneath the polished smile. A drowning man, realizing the rope in his hand was smoke. Valerie placed herself between us. Dad, why don't you go downstairs and rest? Her voice was soft, but her eyes were frantic. I nodded weakly and turned away. Behind me, I heard Derek curse under his breath. That single curse was captured perfectly by the hidden microphone in the office wall. So was the argument that followed. By the time I reached the basement and closed the door, my phone was already vibrating. Mitchell. We got it, he said. All of it? I asked. Everything. Their reaction. Derek demanding the pen. Valerie saying she watched you sign. The panic, the anger. It proves they believe those documents gave them control. I sat down slowly at my desk. Then it's enough? Mitchell was quiet for half a second. It's more than enough. Those words should have made me feel victorious. Instead, I felt strangely hollow. Justice sounds satisfying from a distance. Up close, it often feels like standing in the ashes of something you once loved. Above me, Valerie and Derek were still arguing. Their voices rose and fell through the ceiling. I did not need the microphones to know what was happening. Their false victory had been taken away, and now fear was pushing them toward mistakes. Less than 20 minutes later, Derek stormed down the basement stairs. He didn't knock. He pushed the door open and stood there breathing hard. "We need to talk." I looked up from my chair. "About what?" "About yesterday." "What happened yesterday?" His face tightened. He hated the performance now. "Don't play games with me." I let the silence stretch. Then Valerie appeared behind him, pale and tense. "Derek, stop." He pointed at me. "He knows." The room became completely still. Valerie froze. I did not move. "Knows what?" I asked quietly. Derek stared at me, and in that moment, his desperation overpowered his intelligence. "Everything." Valerie whispered his name, but it was too late. The word had already left his mouth. Everything. A small word. A devastating admission. Mitchell would love that one. I blinked slowly and leaned back. "I don't understand." Derek laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Of course you don't." Valerie grabbed his arm. "Leave him alone. Not because she wanted to protect me. Because she wanted to protect the plan." Derek pulled away from her. "The plan is falling apart, Val." Another admission, clear, direct, recorded. Valerie's eyes widened with pure terror. She looked toward the ceiling, then the walls, suddenly paranoid in the very house she had turned into a surveillance cage. For the first time, she wondered whether someone else might be watching. I saw the exact moment suspicion entered her mind. She looked back at me, and the fear in her expression deepened. "Dad," she said softly, "what have you done?" I met her eyes. The performance could have continued, but something inside me was tired of pretending. I did not smile. I did not shout. I simply answered, "Less than you have." Derek lunged forward half a step, but Valerie stopped him. "Go upstairs," she snapped. He looked ready to argue, then turned and stormed out. Valerie remained behind. She stared at me for a long time. "You are confused," she said finally. "You are tired. You don't understand how much help you need." Even now, she tried to rebuild the lie. Even now, surrounded by collapsing evidence, she reached for the same weapon. My supposed decline. I stood slowly, not weakly, not shakily. Slowly, deliberately. Her eyes followed me, and for the first time in months, she saw my posture straighten. "Valerie," I said, "you should call your attorney." Her face lost color. "Why?" I picked up my phone from the desk. "Because mine is already on his way." She stepped backward as if I had struck her. Then she turned and ran upstairs. The next 2 hours unfolded with the precision of a controlled demolition. Mitchell arrived first with 2 attorneys and a private security team. Robert arrived minutes later carrying sealed evidence drives. Valerie and Derek tried to block them at the front door until Mitchell calmly informed them that I was still legal owner of the property and had personally authorized their entry. Derek threatened to call police. Mitchell handed him a card and said, "Please do, it will save us time." Derek did not call. That silence told everyone in the room exactly how guilty he felt. Mitchell directed us into the living room. Valerie sat on the edge of the sofa, gripping her phone. Derek paced near the fireplace like a trapped animal. I stood by the window, looking at the rain moving across the yard. Robert placed a laptop on the coffee table. Mitchell set 3 folders beside it. Then he looked at Valerie and Derek. "Before either of you speaks, I strongly recommend contacting legal counsel." Derek scoffed. "This is harassment." Mitchell opened the first folder. "No. This is documentation." The first set of documents concerned the medication, the toxicology report, photographs of the pills, a timeline of when they were administered, notes comparing the drug's side effects to the symptoms Valerie claimed I was developing. Valerie looked down. Derek looked away. The second folder concerned money. missing statements, unauthorized transfers, payments routed through accounts Valerie controlled, Derek's false medical story about Leo, the Miami condominium, the mistress, the debts. Every lie had a receipt, every theft had a trail. Derek stopped pacing. The third folder concerned the guardianship scheme, Dr. Aris, the capacity review, the facility reservation, the transition plan, the signed documents that had vanished, and finally, the recordings. Mitchell pressed play. Valerie's own voice filled the room. Once he's declared incompetent, everything becomes simple. Derek's voice followed. After the court signs off, he can't object to anything. Valerie's face crumpled. Derek shouted, "You recorded us?" Mitchell paused the audio. "Again, I suggest counsel." Derek turned on Valerie instantly. "This was your idea." She stared at him. "Don't you dare." "It was," he snapped. "You started this before I ever needed money." There it was. The marriage cracked open under pressure. Valerie stood up. "You used Leo. You used your own son to steal from my father." Derek laughed bitterly. "And you used your father to build the life you thought you deserved." The room went silent. That sentence did what no folder could have done. It stripped everything bare. No more fake concern. No more family language. No more medical excuses. Just greed accusing greed. Then Valerie turned to me. Tears appeared in her eyes, but they came too late. "Dad, please." I had dreamed of hearing that word with love again. "Dad." But in her mouth now, it sounded like a key she hoped would still unlock me. I looked at her and felt the final thread break. "No." She shook her head. "You don't understand. I understand perfectly." My voice stayed calm. "You decided my life was worth less than your comfort." She began crying harder. I was scared. So was I. The words landed heavily. She looked at me as though she had never considered that possibility. That I had been afraid. That I had sat alone in a basement wondering whether my own daughter was slowly destroying my mind. Derek suddenly moved toward the door. One of the security men stepped into his path. Mitchell looked at him. Leaving would be unwise. Derek's face turned red. "You can't hold me here." "No," Mitchell said. "But the police can." Almost as if on cue, flashing lights appeared through the front windows. Red and blue reflected across the wet driveway. Valerie gasped. Derek went still. Robert had contacted authorities before entering the house. 2 police cars stopped outside. Behind them came an unmarked sedan. Then another. Mitchell leaned closer and spoke quietly to me. "This is the point of no return." I looked at Valerie. Then at Derek. Then at the house that had once felt like a home. It became that a long time ago. Officers entered moments later. Mitchell handed over the evidence summary. Robert provided the drives. The lead detective listened carefully, then turned toward Valerie and Derek. Their faces changed as the questions began. Who authorized the medication? Who redirected the mail? Who prepared the facility paperwork? Who knew about the forged financial transfers? Neither answered directly. They contradicted each other within minutes. Derek blamed Valerie. Valerie blamed Derek. Both tried to blame Dr. Aris. Nobody blamed themselves. That was when I knew there was truly nothing left to save. As the detectives continued, Mitchell guided me toward the front door. "You don't need to watch the rest." I paused in the hallway. On the wall hung an old photograph of Valerie at 6 years old, sitting on my shoulders at the county fair. Her smile in that picture was so bright it almost hurt to look at. I touched the frame gently, then let my hand fall. "No," I said. "I don't." Outside, the rain had slowed to a mist. A black town car waited at the end of the driveway. My suitcase was already inside. I had packed it the night before. Behind me, through the open front door, I heard Valerie call my name. Not Dad this time. Harrison. Maybe because she finally understood that the father she had known was gone. I did not turn around. I walked down the stone path, each step steadier than the last. As the driver opened the rear door, Mitchell's phone rang. He answered, listened for several seconds, then looked at me. "Dr. Aris has been taken in for questioning." I nodded once. No celebration, no smile, just a quiet acceptance that the foundation had finally collapsed. I climbed into the car and looked through the rain-streaked window at the mansion Valerie and Derek had believed they owned. The lights inside glowed warm and beautiful, But now I knew what lived behind them. Not family, not love, just rot hidden beneath expensive walls. The driver pulled away. As the house disappeared behind the trees, my phone vibrated with one final message from Robert. He had forwarded a short audio clip captured moments after I left. Valerie was sobbing. Derek was shouting. Then Valerie screamed one sentence that told me everything. He took everything from us. I looked at the screen, then deleted the message. Because she was wrong. I had not taken everything from them. I had only taken back what they had tried to steal from me. The first morning of my new life began with silence. Not the uneasy silence that had filled the basement of my own house for months. Not the silence of suspicion, betrayal, or fear. This was different. This was peace. I woke up in a beachfront suite, overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The sound of waves replaced arguments. The smell of salt water replaced lies. For several minutes, I simply sat on the balcony, watching the sunrise climb over the horizon. The world looked exactly the same as it had the day before. Yet somehow, everything had changed. For the first time in nearly a year, nobody was monitoring my movements. Nobody was documenting my mistakes. Nobody was slipping pills into my morning routine. Nobody was waiting for me to disappear. I was free. Mitchell called shortly after breakfast. "How are you holding up?" he asked. I looked out toward the ocean. "Better than I expected." He laughed softly. "Good. Because things are moving quickly back here." Over the following weeks, the consequences began arriving one by one. The investigation into Dr. Aris expanded almost immediately. Once authorities examined his records, they discovered irregularities in multiple guardianship-related cases. Several former patients and families came forward with complaints. Professional review boards opened inquiries. His medical license was suspended pending investigation. The man who had spent years helping others take control of vulnerable people suddenly found himself answering questions under oath. Derek's situation deteriorated even faster. The financial evidence Robert uncovered created a domino effect throughout his life. Creditors filed additional claims. Business partners withdrew support. Hidden debts surfaced. Bank accounts were frozen. Every attempt to escape one problem exposed three more. Within 2 months, the carefully constructed image he spent years maintaining collapsed completely. The luxury lifestyle vanished. The Miami condominium disappeared. The people who once called him a friend stopped answering their phones. Desperation had driven him to build the conspiracy. Desperation ultimately destroyed him. Valerie's punishment proved different, harder in some ways, easier in others. No police officer placed handcuffs on her. No dramatic arrest occurred. Instead, she was forced to live with the consequences of every choice she made. Public court records revealed her role in the guardianship scheme. Former friends distanced themselves. Professional opportunities disappeared. But none of that seemed to affect her as much as one simple reality. She lost her father. 6 months after I left, she sent her first letter. Mitchell forwarded it to me. I stared at the envelope for nearly an hour before opening it. The handwriting was familiar. The words were not. She apologized. She explained. She blamed fear, stress. Derek. Bad judgment. Poor decisions. The letter contained many things. One thing it did not contain was accountability. I folded it, placed it back inside the envelope, and never responded. 3 more letters arrived over the following months. Then another. Then another. The apologies became longer. The explanations became shorter. Eventually, the excuses disappeared altogether. The final letter contained only one sentence. "I would give anything to go back." I believed her. The tragedy was that some doors only close once. Around the same time, Leo turned 12. Throughout the entire nightmare, I had worried most about him. He was the only innocent person caught in the middle of the disaster. The only person who never lied to me, never manipulated me, never asked for anything except time together. Through legal arrangements established before I left, I remained part of his life. We spoke regularly. We visited each other during school breaks. Slowly, carefully, we rebuilt something healthy from the wreckage surrounding us. One afternoon, while we sat fishing together near a quiet pier, Leo looked at me and asked a question no child should ever have to ask. "Did Mom really do those things?" I watched the water for several seconds before answering. "Yes." He nodded slowly. Then he asked another question. "Do you hate her?" The answer arrived immediately. "No." Leo looked surprised. Why not? I smiled sadly. Because hate keeps people connected to the past. He thought about that for a long time. Then he returned to fishing. Children understand more than adults realize. Back home, the legal proceedings continued. Mitchell kept me informed, but I stopped following every detail. Not because I didn't care, because I finally understood something important. Justice is not revenge. Revenge focuses on the people who hurt you. Justice allows you to move beyond them. For most of my life, I believed success was measured by what a person built. The size of a company, the value of investments, the number of properties, the balance inside a bank account. The past year taught me a different lesson. Success is not measured by what survives around you. It is measured by what survives inside you. And somehow, despite everything Valerie and Derek had done, they failed to destroy the most important thing I possessed: myself. 1 year after leaving the house, I returned to the mainland for the dedication of a new charitable foundation. The Theodore Bennett Family Trust had been reorganized into a program designed to help elderly individuals protect themselves against financial exploitation, guardianship abuse, and manipulation. Attorneys volunteered their services. Investigators provided resources. Medical professionals offered independent evaluations. Hundreds of families received assistance during the first year alone, then thousands. During the opening ceremony, a reporter approached me. "Mr. Bennett, after everything you've experienced, do you have any regrets?" The question followed me for several seconds. Finally, I answered honestly. "Only one." The reporter waited, cameras focused. The crowd became quiet. "I regret ignoring warning signs because I believed love alone could protect people from bad choices." The reporter nodded thoughtfully. "And what are you most proud of?" This time, the answer came easily. "I survived without becoming like them." Later that evening, after the speeches ended and the guests departed, I found myself alone on a terrace overlooking the city. The lights stretched endlessly into the distance. Somewhere among those lights lived Valerie. Somewhere among those lights lived the memories of the family I once believed would last forever. I thought I would feel sadness. Instead, I felt gratitude. Not for the betrayal. Never for the betrayal. For the truth. Because truth had given me something I never could have found inside that house. Freedom. A few days later, another letter arrived. Valerie's final letter. There was no apology this time. No request for forgiveness. No explanation. Just a photograph. It showed me carrying her on my shoulders at the county fair when she was 6 years old. The same photograph I had seen hanging in the hallway before I left. On the back, she had written 8 simple words. "I miss the father I threw away." I sat quietly for a long time staring at those words. Then I placed the photograph inside a drawer and closed it. Not because it meant nothing, because it meant too much. Some wounds heal, some become scars, and some simply become part of the story a person carries forever. That evening, I walked along the shoreline as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon. The ocean breeze felt cool against my face. Families laughed in the distance. Children played near the water. Life continued, exactly as it always does. I stopped near the edge of the surf and watched the waves roll in. Then I thought about the sentence that started everything. The best gift Dad could give us would be the day he's finally gone. Valerie believed my absence would solve her problems. Derek believed my removal would save his future. They were both wrong. In the end, the greatest gift wasn't my absence. It was my refusal to surrender. Because when the truth finally arrived, it didn't destroy my life. It revealed who deserved to remain part of it. I turned away from the ocean and started walking home. Not toward the life I lost, toward the life I finally reclaimed.